Brian, thank you very much indeed for your introduction, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, my first opportunity, I think, to address Bright Blue on the subject of the future of the coalition. You've explained to me in the notes that you sent out before this meeting that, and I quote, Bright Blue exists for conservative means, markets, big action, decentralisation, to deliver progressive ends, fairness, equality and justice. And it's no surprise, therefore, that you, like me, have been very strong supporters of the coalition we've had in the United Kingdom since May 2010. However, if I had the chance to amend your description of your purposes, I would rather remove the word conservative from conservative means and replace it with small l liberal means to achieve progressive ends, but we will not split too many hairs at this stage of the evening. You've asked me to make this speech at what is, I think, an interesting time for the coalition. For the first time, there are, in the media, one or two voices predicting that the coalition will not run its full term. And for those who are hoping that this is what I'm going to conclude tonight, I'll break the bad news early so that you can get back home. I come here to praise the coalition and not to bury it. I both hope and expect that the coalition will last its full 5 years, and I believe that the leaders of both parties and the overwhelming majority of the coalition MPs remain very firmly committed to this enterprise. I want to ask 3 questions tonight. Firstly, how has the coalition been operating today over the period since May 2010? Secondly, what are the challenges that it now faces in sustaining itself over the years ahead? And thirdly, how should the leaders and supporters of the coalition address these challenges? And I'll start, obviously, before we move on to the future, by reflecting a little bit on the past. At a time when people are seeking to be more critical and questioning the coalition, I think it's very important that we shouldn't lose sight of its many achievements. Within 5 days of the general election, our two parties were able to come together in the national interest to craft a clear and strong policy platform to the surprise of very many people. And who would have dreamt before the election that you could throw together the parties of Shirley Williams and Norman Tevick, Bob Russell and Peter Bone and Steve Webb and Duncan Smith, and forge out of this a strong government with a coherent programme which enjoys the complete confidence of our allies abroad and of the world's financial markets. And while there is sometimes an understandable focus on the differences between parties, what is striking to me is that on most days you can switch on the news media and be completely unaware that Britain is a country that is governed by a coalition of 2 different parties with different histories and to some extent different values. Indeed, this government is arguably far more stable, far more united and far more collegiate than many previous single-party governments in this country and overseas, reminding us of Vince Cable's comment at the first cabinet meeting in May 2010 that his Indian relatives had once informed him that arranged marriages can be more stable and successful than those born out of natural impulses. All parties are, of course, coalitions of one sort or another. You only have to reflect back on the years of the Blair-Brown saga to see what fractious single-party government can look like. And there's a wonderful story, I don't know how many of you have read the fascinating memoirs of Jonathan Parrott, Blair's Chief of Staff, obviously. There's a wonderful story in there about the constant battles between Brown and Blair over all sorts of really quite fundamental things in government. And a wonderful anecdote when he recalls in late 2001, the late 2001 period, that, and I quote, the only time I saw Gordon appear to cheer up during our cabinet meetings in that period was when the war cabinet was told that there was a specific terrorist threat to Tony Blair's life. That is a reminder, before we forget it, of how fractious that last single-party government was, and actually how relatively united our coalition has been. Let me reflect briefly on why the coalition has been so successful today. Firstly, it started with a very bold and constructive policy platform. It probably helped, in my view, that both parties had come in from the opposition who carried none of the baggage that you have, when you've been in government for 13 years, the unwillingness to negotiate away policies that you have a direct stake in. It was also crucial for the Liberal Democrats in particular that there was such a degree of unity in our party about our decision to join the coalition. Not a single Lib Dem MP or Lib Dem MP voted against the coalition agreement. And with great apology to my colleague Len Oakley, I have to say that there remains no credible alternative Lib Dem strategy for this Parliament and for managing the unparliamentary circumstances that we're now in. And that's a very stabilising impact, I think, on my party and on the coalition. Secondly, the party leaders began by fully embracing the potential benefits of coalition. You'll remember the rather striking early claim that both leaders made, that their programme was going to be better not worse, as a consequence of it being selected and chosen from the strongest policies of both individual parties. That's a phrase you don't often hear from party leaders who necessarily tend to be pretty partisan about their own programmes. And thirdly, the coalition has worked incredibly well in practice, in a functional sense. And I mean in particular that the two party leaders created very robust structures to resolve coalition policy tensions and disagreements. There's not only the cabinet, but there's the quad, which is the real inner cabinet of the coalition, with two Conservatives and two Liberal Democrats working together to debate and hammer out each policy decision before it's announced. And the existence of the quad, I think, is a great tribute to the Prime Minister's management of the coalition. Can you imagine what type of quad arrangement there would be if we'd gone as a party into coalition with Gordon Brown? I imagine that it would probably be Gordon, the two Eds, and one of his rather ferocious press officers. I suspect that my party would have been unaware of the existence of such a group and let alone being members of it, and I suggest that we would probably have heard about major changes in government strategy in the same way as most Labour cabinet ministers and Gordon Brown, i.e. through the media, rather than through cabinet discussion. And the quad for this coalition is crucial because it gives the Lib Dems a real and powerful voice in the heart of the coalition, along with, of course, responsibility and ownership for the difficult policy choices that we have to make. And I'm sure that this is one of the reasons why I cannot recall any occasion when any of my most senior Lib Dem coalition colleagues have expressed either privately or publicly any real bitterness or resentment about the way in which the coalition operates. The fourth unifying factor has undoubtedly been the economy. At the very first negotiating session in May 2010, the economic challenge and the economic threat has been a great unifying force for this government, demanding coherence to resolve the problems and to restore stability in calm markets, and also, of course, uniting both parties against the previous government, which I think was very important for creating a common narrative and sense of identity in the coalition began. And here I'd like also just a tiny bit of credit, not for our economic strategy after less than a month in office, but for my suggestion to Nick Clegg that the Lib Dems needed to take a senior post within the Treasury, the job of Chief Secretary, rather than transport portfolio, which I believe that we were probably in line for. The day after this decision, one Lib Dem, I can guess who, but I won't name the individual, was quoted in the paper saying, "Who wants to be Paul George Gordon's hatchet man?" What sensible party would want to be in a coalition government locked out of the most powerful and influential department? And would it be realistic to think that voters would excuse the Democrats for any blame for our choices simply because we didn't have a Treasury Minister? And amongst all the challenges of the last 2 years of the coalition, the job which has notably failed to bar has been any division over the economic strategy. This has been hugely important for the coalition and for the country. And the programme for economic recovery is indeed another of the factors which points very powerfully to this Parliament running its full term to 2015. Both parties want to be able to go back to the country in the next election having totally or almost completely cleared up the mess left behind by Labour. And it's very clear that this was a task for 5 years and not for 3 years. So enough of the past. I now want to move on to look at and consider the health of the coalition today. And also to consider the issue about why some people are predicting the coalition's demise. And I think there are 3 These factors are time, party politics, and in particular, third-party coalition politics. Most of these points, other than the last one, are so obvious that they really need not to take us for very long. Firstly, time. It is generally accepted, I think, that the easiest and most exciting part of any new relationship comes at the beginning. And you'll all remember the freshness and sense of hope and possibility that hung in the air in the Downing Street garden during that first joint press conference. Reflect on the surprise of both the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives in government in finding out that their coalition partners were not nearly as dreadful as they had each been claiming, both internally and externally, over many, many years. But as in all of the relationships that we're accustomed to seeing, this starry-eyed start is never going to last forever. Proximity and familiarity inevitably breed a mutual irritation at times and occasionally battering too. The grind of government takes its toll, and the imperatives of party politics reassert themselves. None of this, I think, is remotely surprising, and none of it suggests to me that the coalition is in danger. Point 2 then, party politics. However much we agree, we clearly do disagree in some policy areas, no doubt to the immense degree of many of those in our individual parties. And while you have distinct different parties with their own traditions, you're going to get these disagreements. And of course, those on the left of the Lib Dems and those on the right of the Conservative Party may be frustrated by seeing for them the coalition as a marginalising force, requiring, as it does, two parties to develop a more centrist policy agenda. Many of us will welcome this strengthening of the centre, but we can hardly expect those whose influence is diminished to welcome it too. But none of this is permanent. My final point about the challenges of coalition is, I think, the most important one, particularly for understanding the position of the Liberal Democrats. It affects the way in which the coalition operates, and it's undoubtedly a potential source of friction. It's a point about the asymmetric nature of the political risks that coalitions bring. The Prime Minister took, I think, a very bold decision in forming a fully fledged coalition in May 2010. Many Conservatives, perhaps some of you here in the room, think that the Liberal Democrats should just now shut up and be eternally grateful to have some real power after many years in the wilderness, and that we should just get on with government. And the problem is that the evidence suggests that the risks of going into the coalition government are not equal as between the larger and the smaller parties. Let me read you part of a once confidential note which the then Lib Dem campaigns chief, Chris Reynolds, sent to Paddy Ashdown in 1997 before a secret Downing Street dinner at which Tony Blair and Paddy Ashdown were to discuss the possibility of cooperation, including a coalition. The note reminds us, incidentally, of the sensitivity of coalition possibilities in those days. It's partly drafted in a code to reflect Paddy's clandestine past and obsession with secrecy. And it talks of OMF, which those of you in the know will remember stands for Our Mutual Friend, which was Mr. Blair in those days, and of course TFM, the Full Monty, which was Paddy's code for coalition. And in this, Lord note to Paddy before going to the meeting, Chris Reynolds notes, you've asked me to study the effects of coalitions abroad. In every case, the junior coalition partner loses support. And Lord Reynolds' warning that this potential short-term political price to the smaller party has proved to be well judged. Its realisation has not surprised the leadership either. Since the general election, Conservative support has remained remarkably stable. The Lib Dem support, however, has fallen as some tactical voters have returned to their traditional fold, and as others revert for now to the old thinking that they have to choose basically between one of the two main parties, the largest parties, rather than being a three-party system. On the doorsteps, Lib Dem voters have told us that they want to see Lib Dems having a greater influence in government. And it's ironic that our voters hold this view precisely at a time when many Conservative MPs regard Lib Dem influence in the coalition as excessive and say so quite vocally sometimes on the floor of the House of Commons. It's arguable that the very success of the Quad process in resolving differences in private means that Lib Dem voters are less aware of the real influence that their party has. In Lord Reynolds' note, the answer to this problem is very simple: a change to a fairer electoral system. Sadly, as you may have noticed, our efforts to persuade the public to vote for a change in the electoral system for Westminster have not so far been entirely successful. The failure of the AD referendum makes it even more important, therefore, that people understand what the Lib Dems are delivering as value to them as individuals in government. And hence what has become known as differentiation, which means trying to ensure that people know what we Lib Dems are fighting for in coalition on their behalf. And this, of course, will not be a one-way street, as Conservatives also seek to retain their identity in coalition. Coalitions in general, in my view, can't operate successfully in the long term in these circumstances if both parties are denied any freedom to breathe and to express and to develop their own identities. I think David Cameron and Nick Clegg no doubt both understand this. So potentially our coalition is stronger and more durable if we can find ways of letting the separate identities of the parties be expressed. But it's fair to warn that this process of differentiation also has its particular dangers, and it's to these dangers that I want to return in my concluding comments and recommendations. I've made clear that I'm confident that this coalition is going to see out its full 5-year term. The unity of my party, the good working relationships in the government, the agreement over economic strategy, the determination to make coalition work, all of these point very strongly to the May 2015 general election. But how should we manage the challenges of the next few years? I offer these 3 thoughts from backbenchers. Firstly, it's essential that the government remains focused on its big challenges and does not allow itself to be seriously distracted either by events or by the small change in politics. Of course, there will be events which will be unexpected and need managing, which cannot be timetabled, but the remorseless focus has to be on a few key areas. Time is already slipping away faster than we understand as we approach the midpoint of the Parliament. So when the government reviews its progress later on this year, it shouldn't have in mind a second detailed coalition agreement with hundreds of shiny new policies. We should, in my view, instead, review the 2010 policy programme and ask how this is progressing and what new initiatives are needed to meet the existing goals. My second conclusion is this: let us make sure that the big ambitions in government are not limited to economic recovery and to balancing the books alone, crucial though this is. Both of our parties are actually united in demanding a social recovery strategy to go alongside the economic recovery. Not, as under Labour, interventions based on a nanny-knows-best central state, which might embed cultural dependency, but a social strategy that tackles the causes of the divisions in our society. After our economic programme, the reform of education and of our pensions and welfare systems are the most important challenges facing us. By and large, these are also areas where the coalition is united. And they're areas which stir passion from both Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, and I think voters as well, which are for many people more innovating than the hard slog towards balancing the budget. So our Liberal strategy for social recovery should be the coalition's other essential mission. My final thoughts are on this tricky issue of differentiation. I've made clear my view that coalitions will actually be more sustainable if parties are free up to a point to express their identities and stake out vital ground. David Cameron, Nick Clegg and George Osborne are all wise enough and grown up enough to know that. But there are some very big dangers for the coalition in the strategy of differentiation. Firstly, a process which starts with modest intentions in a few discrete areas of policy could, if not carefully contained, become contagious and damaging. Actions that cause resentment often prompt counter-reaction. And it would be very unwise to allow divisions to open up over our broad economic strategy. There would be a direct price to pay for this in the market. Fortunately, I can detect no key differences on the macroeconomic strategy. Furthermore, it is, I believe, easier and lazier to differentiate in government by saying no to things than it is to develop a positive policy agenda. Blocking things we've seen in coalition is much easier for both sides than actually building constructively. Of course, both parties will occasionally want to say no and need to say no. But if both parties sought to differentiate, just by blocking each other's ideas, then we'd end up with a policy paralysis that would undermine the coalition, sour relations between the parties, and be very bad for Britain. The Liberal Democrats in particular cannot only adopt a role as the coalition's brake, we need at times to be its accelerator too, as we are right now, I think, when we push for faster action to cut taxes for those on low and middle incomes. Finally, there is also a danger that in differentiating, the two coalition parties will each undermine their own processes of modernisation by seeking to differentiate on their traditional counter-flanking issues. Bluntly, there is a danger of each party playing to its own weaknesses. Some of us in the Lib Dems worked in opposition to seek to make our party more economically credible, more engaged in debates over public service reform, more inclined to a liberal approach to taxation, the state, and the European Union. We worked to create a party ambitious for real influence and not one stuck in the rut of oppositionism. In government, differentiation could very easily mean reoccupying old, outdated positions, and if we made that mistake to achieve short-term differentiation, it would be a very big long-term blunder. And it's not my job to advise the Conservative Party either on its modernisation, but the pre-2010 moves by David Cameron to widen the party's appeal on personal liberalism, on green issues, and on social policy could also be undermined in a process of differentiation along more traditional lines. Putting this challenge in another way, before 2010 the Conservative Party was economically liberal, but it wanted to be more socially liberal too. The Liberal Democrats had the opposite challenge, and it would be a great pity for both parties if we decided that now we're in government, we can allow our coalition partner to supply whichever component of liberalism it is that we lack. So my conclusion is this: a certain amount of differentiation is helpful, but it has to be constructive differentiation and not lead to policy paralysis. And it must mean, which Liberals in both parties should welcome, a constructive competition over new ideas, sometimes publicly aired and sometimes not, which is designed to take us faster and further towards the existing commonly stated goals. And we would not be sensible, and what would not be sensible would be a destructive breakdown of coalition trust and discipline, which would be bad for the government, bad for the country, and which would undermine the necessary modernisation of both parties. So let me just finish with these thoughts. Many people say in England, and it's quoted very often, that this is a country, the United Kingdom, that doesn't like coalitions very much. In fact, this coalition started off being very well regarded, and it still enjoys the support of something like half of the electorate. There are many reasons for people to fall out of love, boredom, tribalism, and the day-to-day frustrations of government. However, there are some of us who believe in the capacity of this coalition to be a great reforming government for Britain. And there are some of us who still believe that bold, early claim that our government can actually be a better one for drawing on the traditions of both parties. We have a responsibility to continue to loyally support this coalition in realising its true potential. And we have an opportunity in government to be constructive, creative and imaginative. And those of us who are Liberal Democrats have to demonstrate that our party is fit to be a natural party of government. Moreover, we have a duty not just to retain our party's distinct identity and independence, but to ensure that we play our full part in making this coalition government